I'm Matt Gishard, and this is No Holds Barred. In today's episode, I want to talk about nursing homes. In particular, I want to talk about the care that is required by staff and some of the issues that can arise with elderly people, and then more particularly, people who have some form of dementia. We talk about the cases, we handle the cases, but many times we're puzzled, how could this possibly have happened? The case that I'm going to initially talk about is a caregiver at a nursing home was in a room with somebody who had dementia. He left the room, and during the time that he left the room, for whatever reason, the patient who had some form of dementia picked up a bottle of cleaning fluid and drank it, and ultimately died. And kind of a horrific case. And when you think about putting an elderly person into a care home, you're hoping that, of course, that they're cared for, they're watched over. That's the reason why they're there. There certainly was nothing intentional about that conduct, but did it fall below the standard of care? Well, the district attorney's office seemed to think it did, because they charged that caregiver for involuntary manslaughter for allowing that patient to drink that. And puzzling as to why would such a thing happen. It clearly was a mistake. It was not intentional. But that's what happened. We think of the cases that we've had where somebody's fallen out of bed and broken bones. They've been given the wrong medicine. So I want to go back when we get cases such as that. I want you to understand that there's the Department of Health Services in the state of California, and care homes, nursing homes, have an obligation to report any such things that happen. So somebody falls out of bed and breaks a leg, or falls out of their wheelchair, or is given the wrong medication, or some things happens. The care home has a duty. First of all, they chart that. They chart every day all the various things that happen, and then they have to report it to the Department of Health Services. You can actually go online to the Department of Health Services, and you can actually look at various care homes, whichever one you want, if they're licensed by the state, and find out if there are any complaints, what those complaints are. And many times they do relate to some kind of non-intentional acts. Occasionally we hear about the intentional acts of abuse at a care home, sexual abuse or some other. But for the most part, it's kind of the sad case of somebody develops a terrible bed sore and it's not properly cared for. Somebody ingests the wrong kind of medicine or cleaning fluid or whatever. And they are such vulnerable people that our laws create a higher standard. And those care homes have to live up to that higher standard. So we've often had cases, and it's difficult. So we've represented care homes, and we've represented people that have been in care homes. And you can see how this works, that oftentimes, say, the night shift, considering the number of patients, they're supposed to have 5 caregivers on the night shift, let's say. And on a particular night, one just doesn't show up and another one calls in sick. You're down to 3, less than the law requires. Well, you can call and to an agency and say, we need 2 people. Well, I'm sorry, we can only give you 1. So there you have it. So you have 4 and you need 5. And whose fault is that? It's really nobody's fault. But things can happen when you have less care than you should have. So a recent case that we had was somebody who is totally disabled, unable to use her arms or her legs in any fashion. Usually has, these little side rails on her bed that keep her safe. And for some reason, one of them was left down during the night. And for whatever reason, she rolled out of bed and broke her hip. She was elderly. It was a very, very serious injury to her. We represented the family in that particular case, and the fact is we looked at the charting, we looked at things, and we entered into an agreement that this kind of thing would not happen, that they would keep the number of people there caring for people, and it actually turned out well for everyone, and she survived and is now thriving. That's the good news. But sometimes we hear about the bad news in which somebody expires. And what happened? We had a case in which somebody had Alzheimer's, they had cancer, they were diabetic, and they actually died in the autopsy. They died because they had insufficient fluid. They didn't have enough water in their system. And clearly, somebody wasn't paying attention. They weren't feeding them properly or hydrating them properly. And again, that's something that we're quite concerned about. I will say it's funny, but it's not funny. It was a case in which a care home was caring for somebody. They died. They were taken off to a funeral home. And when we looked at their records, they charted the medicine and the feeding of that person for 5 days after they had already left the facility. So you think that the workers being overworked would going into a room and charting things that they're supposed to chart on a regular basis as they go. But in this case, I would say got in a bit of trouble for charting 5 days after a person died, both medicine intake and food. I say this a bit facetiously, but the fact of the matter is, as I say, the higher care that require people to care for somebody in a care home, particularly people who have Alzheimer's and can't care for themselves, and we rely on that help, put our loved ones in with the hope that they'll be properly cared for. And I will say that by and large, they are properly cared for in most cases, and the stories that we hear are sometimes tragic, and sometimes they work out okay. The important thing is if you put your loved one into a care home, visit them regularly, talk with the nurses, talk with the staff, ask to see the chart to ensure that they're being properly hydrated and fed properly, and take proactive help in how you want to deal with that. There often is a contract that you have to sign, and generally it's not the patient because the patient's not cared for, but the person, the conservator, whoever is caring for them has to sign a contract, and there are a number of things. And you want to read that contract and understand what your rights are. You want to do some research on the care homes and see what kind of complaints there may be or may have been. And then I want to just go back, and I'm going to watch carefully, and we'll talk about it in the future, how that case progresses in the criminal side that I talked about, where the patient drank some fluid and ultimately died, and see what the result is. Because from a legal standpoint, we're trying to think to ourselves, well, there was negligence, civil negligence, but was there criminal negligence? And how is the district attorney going to prove that particular case once that case gets to trial? So if you like this episode of No Holds Barred, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps with our YouTube algorithms. And again, with respect to this episode, if you have any questions or any comments, please note them below. And keep in mind that I do read them. And in fact, we're going to have an episode in which I go through the questions that people have asked or the comments and try to answer some questions for you. I'd appreciate it if you do make those comments, and we look forward to hearing from you.